Tonight, Moscow's war games, conspiracy theories on Syria, and cutting off NPR and rural Republicans. An 8-year-old boy has died of gunshot wounds and another child is in critical condition after being caught in the crossfire of a murder-suicide at North Park Elementary School. A man whose wife taught at the San Bernardino school entered her classroom, shooting and killing her before turning the gun on himself.
The suspect had come to the classroom to visit. We believe the 2 children were the unfortunate recipients of injuries by being in proximity to the female at the time.
I have decided it is time for me to step down.
Alabama Governor Robert Bentley resigned today, avoiding potential impeachment. The state ethics office accused Bentley, nicknamed the Love Gov, of using his political power to hide an affair with a senior staffer and coerce the police into covering his tracks. He'll skirt felony charges in the case in exchange for pleading guilty to misdemeanors. Wells Fargo ordered 2 of its former top executives to pay back $75 million in past compensation. The bank released its findings on how and why thousands of former employees opened millions of unauthorized accounts. It found that former CEO John Stumpf and community banking executive Carrie Tolstead created a, quote, aggressive sales culture that forced workers to go to extremes to meet benchmarks. United Airlines released a statement today responding to this video of police forcibly removing a 69-year-old passenger from an overbooked flight. The CEO apologized for, quote, having to reaccommodate these customers from the full flight, but not for the violent incident itself. Charleston church shooter Dylan Roof was given 9 consecutive life sentences today after he pleaded guilty to murder charges. In a separate trial, Roof was sentenced to death in January on federal hate crimes charges. He'll be transferred to a federal prison to await execution. The Assad regime attacked the town of Khan Sheikhoun on Saturday with conventional weapons, inflicting more misery on a population still trying to get to its feet after the government dropped poison gas on civilians there last Wednesday. 7-year-old Maram Halawa was at home when it filled with poison gas, her aunt said.
واما ما بقى بيعرفوا بقينا هي مش بقينا هي مطرح ما بقى يعرفوا ابوها بتبكيها هلا ناس بتقول مخطر وناس بيقولوا شيء مثل الغبار هيك بالسماء بالجو مبين ما حسوا الا هلا بيقولوا يا ولو اسعفوا العالم يا ولو اسعفوا العالم راحوا يرقدوا اللي راح يسعف مات فوق منهم اللي راح يسعف مات راحوا بعد ربع ساعه يسعفوا العالم ماتت.
ضربة المطار الضربة الأمريكية لمطار الشعيرات جيدة بس ما يكفي لوقف هذا النظام المجرم لأنه ما في حد يردعه وبنتمنى أنه الضربات تتكرر على كل المطارات بسوريا.
The international community believes that Syrian warplanes intentionally dropped a nerve agent on Khan Sheikhoun. The Assad government says it didn't, and that it bombed a rebel munitions depot that contained chemical weapons that then dispersed into the air. The Associated Press reported today that American intelligence believes that Russian officials knew about the attack in advance and may have tried to cover it up afterward. Mustafa al-Khalid is one of 5 children. His 4 brothers and sisters died in the attack, and so did his parents.
كنا فايقين الصبح نروح على المدرسة فالماما والبابا قاموا بدهم يفطرونا نزل صاروخ شمينا هيك شم البابا ريحة غريبة ظلنا ريحة كلور متخوفين نحن كنا من الكلور أهلي الله يرحمهم كلهم ما كان حدا منهم عايش شميت بس أنا.
Atrocities like this are supposed to be impossible in Syria. Because in 2013, after Assad's first widely publicized chemical attack on his people, the US and Russia brokered a deal. Russia would work with Syria to remove its chemical weapons, and the US wouldn't attack. Now it's clear that Syria still has chemical weapons, and the US has to figure out what to do about it, and how much to blame Assad's Russian partners. Next up, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, who's heading to Russia for talks on Wednesday. Josh Hirsch reports from Moscow on how the talks could play out.
There's no doubt that the war in Syria has been a grind for the Russians. Thousands of bombing raids and huge amounts of troops invested. But it's also been pretty good for Vladimir Putin. A majority of Russians say they support the campaign, and according to an independent polling center, only 6% of the country strongly does it. That's because Russian officials have consistently characterized defending Assad and fighting ISIS as a key national security matter. And, frankly, because it's made Putin look like a strong and diplomatic leader. For 5 years, he almost single-handedly held off American efforts to oust Assad, including orchestrating the 2013 deal that helped dismantle Syria's chemical weapons program. That deal might be falling apart, but here in Moscow, officials have mostly responded to American rhetoric with bluster of their own. I spoke to Oleg Falachev, a retired colonel who spent most of his career as a journalist at an official military newspaper. He explained the Russian mindset.
Чем сильнее на нас давят, тем жестче будет ответ. Поэтому политика давления, политика принуждения, политика силового вмешательства, она бесперспективна.
The other possibility here is that both sides, the Americans and the Russians, are both speaking very loudly, but when they meet, the tone of the conversation will be more friendly.
Не в интересах России сейчас заниматься конфронтацией, потому что война и конфронтация в сегодняшнем мире, где все очень тесно связано, и где от первого удара крылатыми ракетами до ядерной войны всего один маленький шаг.
It's obvious that both sides are posturing right now. But of all of the American officials who spoke out over the weekend, Tillerson's message was the most conciliatory. If that's what he brings this week to Moscow, it might make Putin pretty happy. And if he doesn't, or if Trump continues to play the wild card, that might not hurt that much either. Because if there's one thing that's more popular in Russia than the war in Syria, it's holding a grudge against the United States.
This is the first time that the Trump administration has actually had to sell a foreign policy. Usually, that would mean rallying the party faithful behind the president. But right now, Trump's America First base isn't entirely persuaded. That dynamic was on display at a town hall held by Republican Congressman Ted Yoho this weekend.
Great crowd. Thank you for being here. Thank you for
Ted Yoho's 2 town halls Saturday spanned 70 miles of his northern Florida district and dozens of topics. When the attack in Syria came up, there was some skepticism.
I'm a little bit concerned about the intelligence that led into the Syria raid. The question is, did somebody in a military intelligence chain either block that information or mislead the president? And if so, would you call for investigation to have those people who lied or misheld information fired?
In his response, Yoho said the man had a point.
There's conflicting reports. They said ISIS did this or the rebels did this, and other people are saying the Assad regime did it. And so I'm very skeptical.
This skepticism is a problem for Trump, a self-inflicted one. He's been telling Americans for months now that a lot of what they see in the media is fake news. So now, when he has to make a controversial decision based on real news, some of his most passionate supporters don't believe it. Take, for instance, Alex Jones, the Trump supporter behind InfoWars, a blog that peddles conspiracy theories. He's been pushing the narrative that Trump was manipulated into dropping bombs.
I said, please don't do this because it's probably a false flag. And I said, even if you're taking out limited sites, this could widen the war. The Russians could respond.
And that puts Republicans like Yoho in the uncomfortable position of trying to placate these skeptics while still backing up the president's decision. Sounds like you do believe that there is some question about what really happened and who was behind that chemical attack. Is that
true?
Yeah,
we knew this last time too. Everybody jumped on and said Assad did this, but then we heard the rebels did it. We heard ISIS did it. I still don't know what the facts were.
I wonder though if you're concerned that that would end up undermining President Trump's credibility if you question sort of the intelligence that went into his decision making.
No, again, we know there were chemicals used. We knew people died from that. And again, to send that message, and it's also to send a message to stop the civil war.
It's been a slow start for Vice President Pence's task force on voter fraud. It's the group charged with investigating President Trump's claims that 3 to 5 million people voted illegally in November. As of last month, the task force still didn't have any members. But state legislators aren't waiting to enact their own protections against voter fraud, real or imagined. So far this session, at least 87 bills have been introduced in 29 states that aim to restrict access to registration and voting. In 3 of those states, Arkansas, Virginia, and North Dakota, alleged fraud was the motivation for the bill. In Virginia, the House passed a so-called Show Me Your Papers bill. It would require a passport or a birth certificate to vote, but only in state or local elections. That's probably because in federal elections, restrictive voter ID laws have been repeatedly blocked by federal courts. But of the more than 500 voting-related bills introduced so far this session, most of them actually try to expand voting access. Wyoming already passed a bill restoring voting rights for people with nonviolent criminal convictions. And by far the most popular of these expansive bills is enacting automatic voter registration. It's being proposed in at least 30 states. And it's already been proven successful. In 2015, Oregon became the first state to pass automatic voter registration. The result? The state saw one of the largest increases in voter turnout in the last election.
I, Neil M. Gorsuch, do solemnly swear.
Neil Gorsuch was sworn in today as the 113th Supreme Court Justice. It's one of President Trump's first big wins since taking office. But even though Gorsuch is a conservative, his particular brand of conservatism may be a problem for the new administration, especially its repeal of the Clean Power Plan.
Neil Gorsuch has a lot of history with the outdoors. Ronald Reagan appointed his mother, Ann Burford, as the first woman to lead the EPA in 1981. And apparently, he loves hiking so much that he started off a 2011 opinion with the words, "Everyone enjoys a trip to the mountains in the summertime." But when it comes to environmental policy, it's not really clear how his affection for the outdoors intersects with his legal philosophy. So here's what we do know. Neil Gorsuch does not like seeing the powers of the courts challenged. And that could set him up for a fight with the EPA's administrator Scott Pruitt and the Trump administration as a whole. The reason for that fight goes back to 1984. That year, a landmark opinion in a case called Chevron versus NRDC said that courts have to defer to the government's interpretation of a law if the intention of that law is unclear. Today, that doctrine is known as the Chevron deference, and it's used as the underpinning for how many agencies justify regulations. And in fact, it was used in 2014 to uphold the EPA's regulation limiting cross-state air pollution. But Neil Gorsuch isn't down with that. In a 2016 opinion, he said that the Chevron deference gives agencies too much power and takes away roles meant for both Congress and the judicial branch. Cut to today. Just last week, the EPA and the Justice Department asked a court to put cases going after the Clean Power Plan on ice. Now, whether or not that request is granted, those cases are likely to end up at the Supreme Court. Problem is, the EPA's administrator Scott Pruitt will almost certainly need the Chevron deference to justify canceling President Obama's environmental regulations. Which means that if Gorsuch sticks to his guns, the US's newest Supreme Court justice and a judge that's been described as being to the right of Antonin Scalia might actually end up, hypothetically, being responsible for maintaining some of the US's most progressive environmental policies.
Public radio is often associated with big city liberalism, which makes it a constant target for defunding by Republicans, despite the fact that all public broadcasting put together represents only 0.01% of the federal budget. President Trump wants to relieve taxpayers of that burden, eliminating all funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. But he'll be cutting off the people who actually rely on public radio: remote, rural, largely Republican voters.
Good morning. You are listening to KFSK Petersburg, a member of the Coast Alaska Regional Public Radio Organization.
In Petersburg, Alaska, if you want to know what's happening today, you have one option. KFSK, the town's public radio station.
It's 4 minutes past 6 o'clock.
Julie Hersey is the morning host. Her day starts with weather. A lot of weather.
Stevens Passage today, southeast winds 15 knots and seas 4 feet. Tonight, south 20, seas 4 feet.
Listening to KFSK is listening to all the quirks of Petersburg, broadcast live all day long.
You know what time it is.
There's Tradio, the on-air version of Craigslist.
Line 3, you're on Tradio.
I have a really nice gun cabinet.
Morning, Hoopy. Hoopy, who's supposed to report on driving conditions, but regularly veers wildly off course.
Because I have a miniature snoodle, and she'll eat everything and anything. And I've always wondered what happens if she ends up grabbing a Tylenol that's been dropped on the floor, or, something.
And volunteer DJs playing music.
Heat wave and nowhere to run. And now back to the music.
You were just nearing the end of your licensing process. Where are you with that now?
Petersburg is blue-collar, red-voting America. And the news department of KFSK, 2 full-time reporters, tells that story. KFSK is also the CNBC of catching fish.
Seiners in Sitka Sound had their first opening yesterday afternoon and caught about 3,500 tons of herring. The fish are caught for their eggs, or roe, which are sold in Asia.
Petersburg, population 3,149, is on Mitkoff Island in southeast Alaska. It was founded in the 1900s by Norwegian fishermen for one reason: ice. The island is close to a glacier, so it was a handy spot for processing fish in the days before refrigeration. Fish came out of the water, ice came out of the water, fish met ice, everyone got paid. A century later, things aren't that different. Most everyone still makes a living because of fish packed in ice. KFSK is part of that economy. Julie doesn't do those long weather breaks because she likes weather news.
But we tried to explain that we have a lot of mariners, a lot of fishermen in this town, and people on the water. Yeah. And people at remote cabins who want to know, can I come up the Narrows? Is it blowing really hard? And for a lot of places that don't have cell service or intermittent, you can't get it on your iPhone.
Sig Mathieson is captain of the Marathon. He's been fishing Alaskan waters since before Alaska was a state.
So even with all this new technology, public radio, that you still need it?
We have a lot of technology aboard the boat. We've got the AIS system so that other boats can see you and pinpoint where you're at, GPS and all of the radar, radio stuff. It does nothing to inform you about what's going on with the fisheries.
This is where Petersburg goes off script. The vast majority of people here are white and work blue-collar jobs. So not surprisingly, last November, President Trump won by 243 votes. And here, that counts as a landslide. And Republicans hate public radio, right? Not in Petersburg. KFSK is among the top 10 public radio stations when it comes to fundraising per capita. In Petersburg, being a Trump booster and a public radio booster isn't strange at all. The station manager at KFSK is Tom Abbott. He's heard Republicans in Washington threaten to cut off public radio funding for years.
You know, what they really think about you is that this is a building full of socialists.
Yes, there we go. Let's get to the meat of it.
That's what they think. That's why they want to cut your money.
Right. This is a red town in a red state. We get tremendous amount of support from people that, probably have that, public broadcasting, but not my station. But they'll say it in general. That's what I think is sort of the crux of it.
KFSK gets around $124,000 a year from the CPB, around a third of its operating budget. If that's cut, the station just can't afford local content.
It would be a dramatic change for us.
Would it kill KFSK?
I think as we know it.
Five Finger Lighthouse, southeast winds at 16 to 17 knots.
That's Vice News Tonight for Monday, April 10th.